Good afternoon. In today's class, we shall be discussing the background of what we commonly know as the Restoration in England, which caused a sea change in the way the English thought and wrote. I begin today's class by referring to the son of Charles I. The son was the Prince of Wales at the time of the English Civil War, and incidentally, it is this son of King Charles I, who later becomes Charles II, and whose ascension to the English throne is commonly termed as the restoration of monarchy in England. Now, going back to 1646, Charles, who was the Prince of Wales, fled to England after Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarians defeated King Charles I's royalists in 1646. In 1649, Charles, the Prince of Wales, vainly attempted to save his father, the king's life, by presenting Parliament a signed blank sheet of paper, thereby granting whatever terms were required to the satisfaction of the Parliament. However, Oliver Cromwell, who was then deciding the political course in England, was determined to execute Charles I, and on January 30th, 1649, the king was beheaded in London. After his father's death, Charles was proclaimed King of England by the Scots and by some of his supporters in parts of England and Ireland, and he travelled to Scotland to raise an army. In 1651, Charles invaded England with the help of that army, but was defeated by Cromwell at the Battle of Worcester. Charles escaped to France and later lived in exile in Germany and then in the Spanish Netherlands. After Cromwell's death in 1658, the English Republican experiment faltered, and Oliver Cromwell's son, who succeeded his father politically, proved to be an ineffectual leader. Oliver Cromwell's son is Richard Cromwell. As a result of this, the public resented much of what was going on in terms of administration in England in that chaos that followed Oliver Cromwell's death, and the public also resented the strict puritanism of the English military rulers. In 1660, what is known, as I told you, as the English Restoration, General George Monk, an emissary, met with Charles and arranged to restore him to the English throne in exchange for a promise of amnesty and religious toleration for all his former enemies, including his father's enemies. On May 25th, 1660, Charles landed at Dover and 4 days later entered London in triumph. Incidentally, it was his 30th birthday, and London rejoiced at his arrival. He was universally welcomed, and in the first year of the Restoration, Oliver Cromwell was posthumously convicted of treason, and his body was disinterred from its tomb at Westminster Abbey and hanged from the gallows at Tyburn. So that was the extent of hatred that people developed against Oliver Cromwell. By the time Charles II turned 30 and returned to England, he had developed a thick political skin and shrewd political realism. This was displayed in the Declaration of Breda, a declaration of 1660 in which Charles offered something to everyone in his terms for resuming the government. In fact, Charles II's tendency was to satisfy almost every political and religious corner so that he could rule at ease. He issued a general pardon, a tolerant religious settlement would be sought, and security for private property would be assured. Never a man for details, Charles often left the specifics to the Convention Parliament, which was functional from 1660 and which composed of members of the competing religious and political parties that contended for power during the chaos of the Commonwealth. The convention declared the restoration of the king and the lords. The convention disbanded the army, fixed an income for the king by maintaining the parliamentary innovation of the excise tax, and returned to the crown and the bishops their estates, which was confiscated earlier by Oliver Cromwell. But it made no headway on a very serious point, the point of religious settlement. Despite Charles's promise of a limited toleration and his desire to accept Presbyterians into the Anglican fold, as detailed in the Worcester House Declaration of 1660, enthusiasts from both sides wrecked every attempt at a compromise. It was left to the Cavalier Parliament, which functioned between 1661 and 1679, to make the hard choices, take tough decisions, and to demonstrate that one of the changes that had survived the revolution was effectively the independence of the Parliament. Despite Charles's desire to treat his father's adversaries leniently and to find a broad church settlement, the Cavalier Parliament sought to establish a rigid Anglican orthodoxy. The imposition of oaths of allegiance and non-resistance to the crown, and an oath recognizing the king's supremacy in church matters and also a supremacy upon all members of local government, which was assured by the Corporation Act of 1661 and then upon the clergy in the Act of Uniformity, which was passed in 1662, led to a massive purge of office holders. Town governors were universally put out of their places, and nearly 1/5 of all clergymen were deprived of their livings. This program of repressive religious legislation, which continued for much of 1661 and 62, was the first of many missed opportunities to remove the underlying causes of political discontent. Though religious dissenters were not a large percentage of the population, their treatment raised the spectre of permanently divided local communities and of potential arbitrary government. This legislation, specifically the Clarendon Code, is inappropriately associated with the name of Lord Chancellor Clarendon, for he as well as the king realized the dangers of religious repression and attempted to soften its effects. Indeed, in central government, the king relied upon men of diverse political backgrounds and religious beliefs and practices. Clarendon, who had lived with the king in exile, was his chief political advisor, and Charles's brother, James, the Duke of York, who incidentally would succeed Charles II to the English throne as James II, was his closest confidant and was entrusted with the vital post of Lord Admiral. General Monk, who had made the restoration possible through his negotiations, was raised to the Duke of Albemarle and continued to hold high military authority over the small standing army which the king maintained. Incidentally, Charles II, in spite of all his good wishes and efforts, could not undo the effects of the revolution. The Commonwealth had to fight for its survival, and in the process, England had become a potent military power. Wars against France and Spain had expanded English colonial dominions. Dunkirk and Jamaica were seized, Barbados was colonized, and the North American colonies flourished both militarily and economically. Colonial trade was an important source of royal revenue, and Charles II, interestingly, continued Cromwell's policy of restricting trade to English and English ships alone, and imposing duties on imports and exports. As a result, colonial trade and English shipping mushroomed. In the long run, Charles's aggressive foreign policy solved the crown's perpetual fiscal crisis, but in the short run, it made matters worse. The Great Plague of London, 1664 to 66, and the Great Fire of London in 1666 were interpreted generally by the common people as divine judgments against a sinful nation. These catastrophes were compounded when the Dutch burnt a large portion of the English fleet in 1667, which led to the dismissal and exile of Clarendon. The Crown's debts led to the stop of the Exchequer Act of 1672, by which King Charles II suspended payment of his bills. Charles II had been wary of repressive Anglicanism, underestimating its strength among rural gentry and clergy, and desired comprehension and toleration in his church. This fit with his foreign policy objectives, for in the Treaty of Dover of 1670, he allied himself with the Catholic France against the Protestant Holland. In exchange, he received a large subsidy from Louis XIV, and in the treaty's secret clauses, known only to the king's Catholic ministers, the promise of an even larger one if Charles undertook at some unspecified amount of time to declare himself a Catholic. That moment came for the king on his deathbed, by which time his brother Anaya, the Duke of York, and James II had openly confessed his conversion to Catholicism. In 1672, Charles promulgated the Declaration of Indulgence, which suspended the penal code against all religious nonconformists, Catholic and dissenter alike. But a declaration of tolerance and toleration could not bring together these mortal enemies, and the king himself was faced by a unified Protestant front. Parliamentary Anglicans would not vote money for war until the declaration was abrogated. The passage of the Test Act of 1673, which the king reluctantly signed, effectively barred all but Anglicans from holding national office and forced the Duke of York to resign the Admiralty. Now we go to another aspect, an interesting aspect which has a direct bearing on Restoration literature, and that aspect is commonly known today as the Popish Plot. Anti-Catholicism united the disparate elements of English Protestantism as did nothing else. Anglicans vigorously persecuted the Protestant sects, especially Quakers and Baptists, who were imprisoned by the thousands whenever the government claimed to have discovered a radical plot against the king. John Bunyan's The Pilgrims' Progress, published in 1678, which became one of the most popular works in the English language, was interestingly composed in prison. Yet dissenters held out against persecution and continued to make their converts in towns and cities. They rallied against the debauchery of court life, naming the Duke of York, whose wedding to the daughter of his brother's Lord Chancellor had scandalized even his own family and the king himself, who acknowledged 17 bastard children but did not produce one legitimate heir to the throne. Most of all, they feared a Catholic revival. The alliance with Catholic France and rumors of a secret treaty, the open conversion of the Duke of York heir to the throne, and the king's efforts to suspend the laws against Catholic office holders were potent signs. Not even the policy of Charles's new chief minister, Thomas Osborne, who was the Earl of Danby, could stem the tide of suspicion. An Anglican, Danby tried to move the crown back into alliance with the majority of country gentry, who wanted the enforcement of the penal code and the end of the pro-French colon policy. He arranged the marriage of Charles's brother, James's eldest daughter Mary, who later becomes Mary II, to William of Orange, who later becomes William III, the Dutch stadtholder. Yet, like the king, Danby admired Louis XIV and the French style of monarchy. He attempted to manage parliament, centralize crown patronage, shore up royal finance, and maintain a standing army. In short, to build a base for royal absolutism. Catholics and absolutism were so firmly linked in the popular mind that Danby was soon tarred by his broad brush. In 1678, a London dissenter named Titus Oates revealed evidence of a plot by the Jesuits to murder the king and establish Roman Catholicism in England. Although both the evidence and the plot turned out to be total fabrication, England was quickly swept up in an intense anti-Catholic hysteria. The apparent murder of the Protestant magistrate who had first heard Oates's revelations lent credence to the rumor. 35 alleged conspirators in what is commonly known as the Popish plot were tried and executed. Harsh laws against Catholics were revived and extended, and Danby's political position was undermined when it was revealed that he had been in secret negotiation with the French. Parliament voted his impeachment and began to investigate the clauses of the Anglo-French treaties in greater detail. A second Test Act of 1678 was passed, barring all but the Anglicans from Parliament, and an exception for the Duke of York to sit in the Lords was carried by only 2 votes. After 18 years, Charles II dissolved the Cavalier Parliament. The mass hysteria that resulted from the Popish plot also had its effects on the country's governors and governance. When Parliament assembled in 1679, a bill was introduced to exclude the Duke of York from the throne. This plunged Britain into its most serious political crisis since the Revolution. Rebellion in Scotland required the use of brutal force to restore order. But unlike his father, Charles II reacted calmly and decisively. First, he co-opted the leading exclusionists, including the Earl of Shaftesbury, the Earl of Halifax, and the Earl of Essex into his government, and then he offered a plan for safeguarding the church during his brother's reign. But when the Commons passed the Exclusion Bill, Charles dissolved Parliament and called for new elections. These did not change the mood of the country, for in the Second Exclusion Parliament of 1679, the Commons also voted to bypass the Duke of York in favour of his daughter Mary and William of Orange, though this was rejected by the Lords again. Parliament was dissolved again, and the king appealed to the country, and again an unyielding parliament met at Oxford in 1681. By now, the king had shown his determination and had frightened the local elites into believing that there was danger of another civil war. He had also taken advantage of the soaring tax revenues as Britain benefited from the end of the European wars in 1678 and 1679. The Oxford Parliament was dissolved in a week. The Whig, which incidentally is a Scottish Gaelic word meaning horse thief, councillors, as they were now called, were dismissed from their places, and the king appealed directly to the country for support. The king also appealed to his cousin Louis XIV, who feared exclusion as much as Charles did, if for different reasons. Louis provided with a large annual subsidy to increase Charles's already plentiful revenues. which had grown with English commerce and mercantile trade. Louis also encouraged him to strike out against the Whigs. An attempt to prosecute Earl of Shaftesbury was foiled only because a Whig grand jury refused to return an indictment. But the Earl was forced into exile in Holland, where he died in 1683. The king next attacked the government of London, calling in its charter and reorganizing its institutions so that Tories, which is an Irish word meaning thieving outlaws, as his supporters were now called, held power. Quo warranto proceedings against the charters of many urban corporations followed, forcing surrenders and reincorporations that gave the crown the ability to replace disloyal local governors. By 1683, Charles II was fully a master of his state, financially independent of Parliament, politically secure, and militarily strong, with loyal Tory servants predominating in local and national government. He died in 1685 at the height of his power. He was soon succeeded by James II. Unlike his brother, James II did not dissimulate for the sake of policy. He dealt plainly with friend and foe alike. James did not desire to establish Catholicism or absolutism, as it was not pragmatic for a king to do so under the circumstance that he was in, and offered what looked like ironclad guarantees for the preservation of the Anglican Church. James came to the throne amid declarations of loyalty from the ruling elite. The Parliament of 1685 was decidedly loyalist, granting the king customs revenues for life, as well as military emergency aid to suppress Monmouth's rebellion of 1685. Now, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was an illegitimate son of Charles II and was Shaftesbury's personal choice for the throne had exclusion succeeded. Monmouth recruited tradesmen and farmers as he marched through the West Country on the way to defeat at the Battle of Sedgemoor. The rebellion was a fiasco, as the local gentry refused to sanction civil war. Monmouth was executed, and more than 600 of his supporters were either hanged or deported in the brutal aftermath of the rebellion. The king, James II, misinterpreted Monmouth's failure to mean that the country would place the legitimate succession above all else. During the rebellion, James had dispensed with the Test Act and appointed Catholics to military command. This led to a confrontation with Parliament, but the king's dispensing power was upheld. James made it clear that he intended to maintain his large military establishment to promote Catholics to positions of leadership and power and to dispense with the penal code. He set out systematically to create a Catholic state. Over the 3 years of his rule, he sacked 3/4 of all justices of peace, 11 of the 12 judges, and most lords lieutenant. Existing penal laws against Catholics were suspended. Moreover, Catholics and compliant Protestant dissenters were appointed at all levels of government. A huge propaganda drive to make converts to Catholicism was launched, and many Catholic churches, schools, and colleges were set up by state action. James set out to appoint Catholic heads to one or more colleges in Oxford and Cambridge with a view to training a new generation of Catholic governors. Unfortunately for James, as he was beginning on his program of action in France, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, the legislation that had protected the rights of the French Protestants for nearly a century. The repression of Huguenot congregations inflamed English public opinion. Thus, the king's efforts on behalf of Catholics was essentially doomed from the very start. He had vainly hoped that the Parliament of 1685 would repeal the Test Acts. He closeted himself with the members of Parliament, one at a time, hoping to browbeat them into agreeing to a repeal of all anti-Catholic legislation, but met stoic non-committal reactions that were masking real anger. Moreover, his effort to forge an alliance with dissenters proved unsuccessful. When James showed favour to William Penn and the Quakers, his leading Anglican ministers, Henry Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, and Lawrence Hyde, Earl of Rochester, resigned. By now, the king was set upon a collision course with his natural supporters. The Tory interest was made up of solid support for church and king. It was James's mistake to believe that they would support one without the other. In 1687, he reissued the Declaration of Indulgence, which suspended the penal laws against Catholics and dissenters. This was a temporary measure, for James hoped that his next parliament would repeal the penal code in its entirety. To that end, he began a systematic investigation of the parliamentary boroughs, restricting the parliamentary franchise, sent to question mayors, lieutenants, and justices of the peace about their loyalty to the regime and their willingness to vote for MPs who would repeal the Test Acts. Most gave tentative answers, but those who stood out were purged from their places. For the first time in English history, the Crown was undertaking to pack Parliament. James was following an even more aggressively Catholicizing policy in his other kingdoms, placing power in Ireland into the hands of the Catholic majority for the first time in a century. Disastrously, when an Irish parliament met, it voted for the return of all the land taken from the nobility and the church over that century. In fact, a majority of all land. When the revolution came, it was especially bloody and violent in Ireland, and it saw a halving of the amount of land held by Catholics and a new and even more severe penal code that threatened the very existence of Catholic worship and rendered the Catholic community at the mercy of a vindictive Protestant ascendancy that continued for 200 years. So this briefly is the socio-political context in which much of the restoration works were written. Thank you.